Hello. I think this is class 8. No, 9. Um, online for urbanism and digital narratives after COVID. We have been covering book Dream Cities just to get a feeling for what types of cities or what the major influence have been on the physiognomy, the sort of aesthetic approaches, practical approaches, but mostly aesthetic, have been to city creation, if there are any sort of plans for a city. Many happen organically, and this discussion will revolve around the last topic, as we covered in this book, which is habitats. Habitats is a fairly recent approach to city creation. I find it one of the more interesting aspects of city design, since I had lived in Tokyo, Seoul, Singapore, some two of the largest cities on earth, Tokyo and Seoul. What exactly are or is an honest approach to cities as sort of a hive mind, a hive center, much like an anteheap. This is the last chapter in the book. What are habitats? The techno-ecologies, the idea that given that cities are a response to human dwelling about 6,000 years old, what puts us in cities, what puts 55% of the world population in cities, what makes cities produce 80% of GDP, what now interconnects cities, what in the terms of this class interconnects the downside to cities, such as COVID-19 spread. What were the approaches to habitats? Did we find habitats in older cities? Perhaps I've been to Canyon de Chelly and the Anasazi ruins of southwest North America, amazing structures built inside cliffs, and perhaps this approaches the greatest sensibility toward these habitats or hive cities. Beautiful dwellings within the cities. For defensive purposes, the ladders could be brought up to protect these cliff dwellers. Çatalhöyük, I hope I'm pronouncing that wrong, one of the first cities in Anatolia, Turkey, follows again many of the early notions of creating hives and clusters of humanities for defensive purposes, but also for the spectacle value that cities create, religious, secular, and otherwise, just commercial spectacle value. The more or less natural tendency of human beings to collect, as we are one of the most intense social primate out of the groups that emerged from Africa. A book I read today, or I am reading, Cities, the First 6,000 Years, says in a sense the city is the first internet. It's a way of condensing information, human information, in a small area to which a individual can travel within, finding out information, totally artificial creation, much like the internet, You can choose to maneuver in different areas to find knowledge, food, things you want. And we could structure this and look at this way that the city has been a 6,000-year-old internet, analog, of course. But this is an interesting, very interesting concept. So the last seventh city structure in this book, Dream Cities, what actually was purposeful about types of city in terms of intentionality and not just organic structure. This is an intentionality put into organic structure. Cliff Hills of Anasazi, Çatalhöyük, many of the early cities of North America, Cahokia, many of the conquistadors who came to North America, Mexico, immediately recognized these large Aztec, Native American structures as cities. So what was common in the creation and production of cities, some of these cities were vast, and the common theme in humanity, even though these had been separate strains of humanity from Western Europe to North America, the Spanish conquistadors still recognized these things as cities in the most pure sense, and often marveled that they were or surpassed some of the greatest cities found in Europe. The Aztec cities, early Mexico City, Mayan cities, as soon as those were discovered, and clearly some of the cities in the upper Mississippi, which it's debatable whether Cahokia was even formed for purely spectacle value and not just commercial value, one of the assumed things. So let's go back to habitats. Where did they happen? They're futuristic. They're constructed of steel, concrete, glass, using innovative structural technique. They're often birthed from the notions of singular architects, different than Corbusier, who, as we saw, developed slabs. Habitat in Montreal. Oh, I forget the architect, the Israeli architect. I met him once. Certainly was a very inspirational city. This includes geodesic domes, Buckminster Fuller, and other space frames providing sort of a sheltering from the elements, core joint systems, reinforced concrete, often incorporating modules, capsules, and expandability. So these are fascinating places where they happened, and some of the driving forces behind this, pedagogically and in practicality, were Japan, post-war Japan, England, and a supergroup out of Italy. A lot of them were theoretical. A lot of them responded to the mod sort of movement of the Cold War era, that if we are condemned to fighting a nuclear war at some point, that earthly Epicureanism is principle. So we examined these three things. Where these things are most advanced, these habitats or cluster cities, techno cities, modular cities, was Japan. In Tokyo, we have the Nangang Capsule Tower. I've been there, I've seen it. It's wonderful. It really inspires, where each unit is a prefab square-ish element that is inserted in a supportive vertical structure. Step and repeat. Kisho Kurosawa was the architect in 1972. Shizuoka Press and Broadcasting Center. Shimbasi Kenzo Tangi, who worked a lot in America at NTU. He built some university structures, Japanese architect. Spiral building in 1985. In Kofu, the Yamanashi Communication Center, Tangi, and Osaka Omida Sky City. So why Japan? Why was this a great response? And at the Japan Center in New York, they did before the Tokyo Olympics, they did a great exhibition on metabolist architecture, called Metabolist Architecture, in England, Japan, and supergroup out of Florence, I guess, Italy. In USA, though, there was Paolo Soleri, who studied with Frank Lloyd Wright in Arizona, formed Acrosanti in Arizona. In Orlando, Florida, uniquely Spaceship Earth, Epcot Center, which is a Disney initiative. Surprise, surprise. Coming out of the American Suburban Mall. In St. Louis, the Climatron Dome Greenhouse, Missouri Botanical Garden, all of these. Safdie was the Canadian-Israeli architect at Montreal Habitat 64, Montreal Biosphere, former U.S. Pavilion Expo 67, London, Thamesmead Housing Estate, Alexandra Road Housing, 30 St. Mary Axe, Norwich, and so forth. Paris, I saw an interesting film kind of responding to the given narratives of the modular living called Future Couple, or something very interesting, how a young couple would live, work, reproduce in one of these modular settings in Paris. I have to look that up, a very interesting multi-part film on this. Singapore Republic Polytechnic Campus, 2007. Variants are dome stadiums, geodesic domes, camping tents, of course, proliferate. Greenhouses in Frankfurt, New York, Hearst Tower, Milan, Bosco Verticale. Living walls, vertical gardens, French designer Patrick Blanc, Euro Cities, Abu Dhabi, Masdar City, Songdo, which I lived at in Korea, one of the first so-called smart cities, part of which is modular. So why do we arrive at these notions of habitats? Why does the city itself go from an accidental creation, sort of an organic termite mound, into something planned, not just from stark-architects, often stark-architects though, into something the civic leader, as the case of Songdo stated, we need to curtail suburban sprawl. We need to shape the economic and even the private life of people. These things are very, very, in a sense, gender motivated to reproduce populations. Certainly Songdo was, as a urban satellite outside of the main city of Seoul. It was about an hour and a half away to the main city. I lived there for a month in teaching at SUNY Songdo, outside of Incheon Airport. And like I contend, like the Levittown houses for returning GIs, this had much to do with forging a gender dynamic within a population to work, play, scripted play, and scripted reproduction. So these are an honest sort of approach to cities as ant heaps, as a way of reducing down and defining narratives of the individual. I contend, I've lived and seen a bunch of these things, that they do reduce a life down into certain algorithms. These modular cities, perhaps the algorithms of Kenan Deshay of, I think it's the 11th century, in the New Mexican cliffs, perhaps had just a rigid narratives, but certainly a city of Songdo that I lived in had its type of cisgender narrative, that the wife would stay in Songdo, the husband would also work there, but eventually the husbands would get on the train, much like 1950s America, and train in hour and a half, 2 hours into Seoul, work, and then return. Perhaps now there's a greater degree of online work, and part of this class is to explore the way online work actually affects implied narratives, implied, for lack of a better word, cisgender reproducing narratives. How would a population remake itself, reproduce? Only women are capable of that. Whether that skews the notion of child rearing in one way, a release for paternal leave, things like that. How, after living in Tokyo, Seoul, Singapore, how the small spaces would accommodate an East Asian notion of space, as well as a Western and certainly North American sense of space, in terms of how much space do you need to raise a child. This is all very interesting in finally looking at this notion. Can we honestly treat our cities as ant heaps and reduce the available algorithms of people down into a handful of things, so that they would not overconsume in these cities, they would not hoard, they would not look beyond that narrative to find greater happiness or pleasure, but somehow having a reductivist narrative. Many of these habitats actually sort of prescribe these narratives, and this is why it did take off in post-war Japan. That reconstructing Japan, I lived in Tokyo under a Japan Foundation grant. It was interesting as a Westerner to see that these implied uses of space become very circumspect. Well, what do you do? Where do you go? How do you work? Are you working online? And how your space actually defines that. So with the Metabolist House, which did, except for these odd places like Acrosanti in Arcosantri, I'm pronouncing it wrong, in America, with Arcosanti, Palo Solari, which very ambitious, but it reduced itself down into sort of the economics of producing crafts. My parents have a couple steel bells from this, which was kind of the economy of the place. But again, there's the great mod and even countercultural and hippie aspect to these habitats in the face of profligate conspicuous consumption from, let's say, the Levittown detached house, your little king on your property with a little front courtyard, and the backyard is for your entertainment. And the detached house had that respect, that notion of the prince, the European prince, to the manor. The habitat was a post World War II notion from Japan. Small is beautiful. Certainly, I've attended some wonderful tea ceremonies and certain particular East Asian ritualized aspects of smallness to bring this space down. There's a concept in the word ma, which is a Japanese Shinto Taoist concept of an interval of time between spaces. The walking in the Zen gardens, ma is a confluence of time and space, where the paving stones are set at unequal distance, so when you step, you have this concept of time studied, or of a notion of time, when the clicking of the shishi-adoshi, the little bamboo lever that fills up with water to click on, after it fills it spills and then clicks on the stone. This again is the concept of ma. These habitat cities are interesting to me as acts of will, as an honest response to notions such as lowering carbon footprint. What would space do to define narrative in individuals? Certainly, how should families come from this? Because East Asia, a lot of East Asia has been very crowded for very long, over 200 years, Japan, in a way that Western Europe and certainly North America has not been. So it's this notion of manifest destiny in America. Oh, we'll always have space out there somewhere. Back to Nomadland, where she does explore the space, but she's in the algorithmic confines of her little van. And you could say it's kind of a mobile metabolist view of her solution to this metabolist response. Is metabolism the future? Can I force this conversation into an area where we talk about what are the best cities, if cities are to survive, if we don't completely go into a Mad Max situation of after a environmental, viral, nuclear, whatever cataclysm, as in Cormac McCarthy's book The Road, an unexplained apocalyptic event happened, and therefore father and son are on the road. What are our willful choices? Cities are known to be more ecologically beneficial than rural areas, certainly more than suburbia with its detached houses. I mentioned many times this notion of post-peak oil as a final reset. Certainly the ecological damage that the use of petroleum has created for almost 200 years is perhaps a symptom of craving, of needing, of responding to how this one substance, petroleum, has propelled our species up to 8 billion or climbing. What is the top limit of we'll get into this with the Architects Anonymous response, and this fits in the response with COVID as interlinked cities, interlinked metabolisms, as it were, and how COVID was passed between cities. The Okay, so what do we got? We have, oh, we're at 25. So metabolist cities are a favorite of mine. We should study them as willful creations toward the end of finding a solution of preserving cities as confluences of good communality, diversity, places of analog spectacle, cosmopolitan centers, a free exchange of ideas, and perhaps the city as a 6,000-year-old internet. Interesting concept. See you in the next lecture.